Two coworkers start contributing to their company's 401k plan on the same day, at the same salary, investing the exact same amount every single paycheck for 30 years. One of them retires with a substantially larger balance than the other, sometimes by well over $100,000. Neither of them picked better stocks. Neither of them timed the market. Neither of them contributed a single extra dollar. The entire difference came down to a number most people never look at, buried in a document most people never read, expressed as a percentage so small it barely looks like it should matter at all. It's called the expense ratio, and over a working lifetime, it is one of the most expensive numbers most people never notice. It's a strange thing to consider that two people can do everything else identically right, same contributions, same discipline, same decades of patience, and still end up in meaningfully different places purely because of a fraction of a percent neither of them ever thought to compare. Retirement plan fees are almost uniquely well hidden, not necessarily because anyone is trying to deceive plan participants, but because of how the disclosure system evolved and how small the numbers look in isolation. According to research published by the Department of Labor and multiple academic studies on retirement plan costs, expense ratios inside 401k funds commonly range from as low as 0.03% for simple index funds to over 1%. And in some smaller company plans, well above that, for actively managed funds carrying higher administrative and management costs. A difference of 1 percentage point sounds trivial when it's described the way it usually gets described, as just 1%. But a percentage point charged annually against your entire account balance, compounding year after year for decades, behaves completely differently than a one-time 1% cost, and almost nothing about how these fees get presented to employees helps anyone intuitively grasp that distinction. This gap matters enormously in dollar terms specifically because retirement accounts are, by design, meant to be held and grown over the longest possible time horizon most people ever invest across, which means even a small, quietly recurring cost gets more chances than almost any other fee in a person's financial life to compound against them. Let's start with the basic mechanics of how expense ratios actually get applied, because the mechanism is simpler than the confusion around it suggests. An expense ratio isn't a one-time transaction fee charged when you buy or sell a fund. It's charged as a small percentage of your entire invested balance, every single year, automatically, quietly deducted from the fund's returns before those returns ever show up in your account statement. The technical process works like this. If a fund earns 8% in a given year and carries a 1% expense ratio, your statement shows a return closer to 7%, not 8% minus a separate 1% fee lined out somewhere visible. The fee is baked directly into the reported performance number itself, which means most people never see it as a distinct, subtracted line item at all. They simply see a slightly lower return than the fund's underlying, publicly reported performance, with no obvious explanation for the gap sitting anywhere on the statement they actually look at. This is where an invisible compounding effect takes over, one that makes a seemingly small annual percentage far more expensive than intuition suggests. A 1% fee doesn't just cost you 1% of your current balance each year. It costs you 1% of a balance that would have been growing on the money the fee already took in every prior year. Over 30 or 40 years, this creates a widening gap that grows non-linearly, meaning the difference between a 0.1% expense ratio and a 1% expense ratio isn't roughly 10 times larger by the end of a career. It's frequently dramatically larger than that because the fee compounds against you in exactly the same mathematical way that returns compound in your favor, just working in the opposite direction the entire time. There's a related invisible mechanism tied to how retirement plans get structured for smaller employers specifically. Larger companies typically negotiate access to lower cost, institutional share classes of the same underlying funds available to individual retail investors, simply because they're bringing a much larger pool of assets to the negotiating table. Employees at smaller companies with smaller total plan assets frequently get offered the exact same funds, but in a more expensive retail share class, sometimes carrying an expense ratio several times higher for functionally identical underlying investment exposure. This means two people investing in what is effectively the same diversified stock fund can pay dramatically different fees purely based on the size of the company they happen to work for, a factor that has nothing to do with their own investment choices, savings discipline, or financial knowledge at all. Two real-world patterns make this concrete. Academic research on 401k plan costs has consistently found that participants in smaller plans, typically defined as those with fewer total plan assets, pay meaningfully higher average expense ratios than participants in large employer plans, a gap that has narrowed somewhat over the past decade due to increased fee transparency requirements and regulatory attention. But that still persists across a significant share of the market. A second pattern shows up in lawsuits specifically, where a growing number of large employers have faced litigation from their own employees over retirement plan fee structures, alleging that plan administrators failed in their legal duty to seek reasonably low-cost investment options for participants, several of which have resulted in significant settlements once the actual dollar impact of the fee difference over decades was calculated and presented in court. These cases are notable precisely because the plaintiffs typically weren't alleging fraud or hidden fees in a legal sense. The expense ratios were technically disclosed the entire time. The argument was simply that a reasonably diligent plan administrator should have negotiated a lower-cost option that was readily available. And the sheer size of the compounded difference over a career was often what made the case worth bringing in the first place. This challenges the common assumption that a small percentage difference in fees is a minor, almost irrelevant detail compared to bigger decisions like how much to contribute or which asset allocation to choose. In reality, over a full working career, the fee percentage on a retirement account can rival or even exceed the impact of many other choices people spend far more time worrying about, precisely because it applies every single year, automatically, regardless of market conditions, contribution amounts, or investment performance. The friction point isn't that people are careless about their retirement savings. It's that fee disclosure has historically been presented in a format, a small percentage buried in dense fund prospectus documents, that almost nobody intuitively translates into its actual dollar cost over multiple decades of compounding. Zoom out, and this same small recurring percentage, large cumulative cost, pattern shows up in plenty of other financial products. Credit card processing fees charged to merchants, often just 2 or 3% per transaction, add up to a substantial recurring cost across a business's entire revenue over years, frequently larger in total than more visible, negotiated costs like rent or major equipment purchases. Currency conversion fees on international transactions and subscription-based software licensing follow similar patterns, where a fee expressed as a small percentage or a modest monthly charge becomes financially significant primarily through repetition and scale rather than through any single transaction looking expensive in isolation. In every one of these cases, the number itself is designed, whether intentionally or simply by convention, to be evaluated as a single instance rather than as a repeated, compounding event, which is precisely the framing that makes a fee look negligible in the moment it's disclosed and only reveals its true size much later, once years of repetition have quietly done the actual work. So the next time a retirement account statement shows an expense ratio expressed as a small decimal percentage, it's worth remembering what that number actually represents over the full span of a career. It isn't a minor rounding detail sitting quietly in the background of a much bigger financial picture. It's a compounding cost, working continuously in the opposite direction of the very growth the account is supposed to be building, and the gap between a low-fee option and a high-fee option, invisible in any single year, can end up representing one of the largest financial differences most people ever experience, all without a single visible transaction ever announcing that it happened.